from Dr. Anantanan Rambachan. Dr. Rambachan is a professor of religion, philosophy, and Asian studies at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. He has been involved in the field of interreligious relations and dialogue for over 25 years, a stalwart instigator of Hindu studies at the AAR, as many of you know. And he has contributed to numerous consultations and discussions convened by different organizations, including the World Council of Churches, the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue at the Vatican, as well as serving as a member of the Consultation on Population and Ethics, and advisor to the Pluralism Project at Harvard University. He is a member of the International Advisory Council for the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, of the Theological Education Committee of the American Academy of Religion. He has been a pioneer in the field of Hindu theology and Hindu thought, and has published widely on a variety of topics pertaining to the engagement of the Hindu tradition with ethics and social problems and social justice. His publications include Accomplishing the Accomplished, The Limits of Scripture, The Advaita Worldview, God, World, and Humanity, The Hindu Vision, Hikam Dharma, is that close enough? The Essential Teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, and A Hindu Theology of Liberation. And most recently, if you go into YouTube, you can find some clips of this. The British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, has transmitted a series of 25 lectures given by Professor Rambachan around the world. And for many of my colleagues here at the GTU, of course, he is no stranger to our community. He was the Surjit Singh lecturer in 2015, where he spoke on comparative religious thought and culture from his perspective. So please join me in welcoming once again Professor Rambachan to the GTU.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And, I hope you are enjoying your lunch. Please continue eating. This is the difficult shift, of course, and I hope I can keep you awake with what I have to say. But let me say, first of all, what an honor it is to be here, to have this opportunity to engage in this conversation with you. To thank the Center for Dharma Studies and the GTU, my dear friend Vijay Sharma, and of course Purushottam is here as well, all of whom made my visit possible. I am going to strike a different note, perhaps from what you've heard before. And I hope that if we conceive of the conference as a symphony, that this note also has a place in this symphony. I speak of it as a different note because I want to deal with someone who perhaps in recent times has been the most vigorous challenge of the tradition to which I belong, and who spent his life making the point that this tradition, we can't even speak about flourishing, but this tradition did not even allow him and his community to sustain itself. It didn't provide a sustaining framework for his community. And so it highlights the point that religious traditions are not always sustaining traditions. They don't always create the framework that allow human beings to flourish. And clearly, Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar thought that the Hindu tradition did not both sustain and allow for his flourishing. So I see him as a great challenge to what it means to be Hindu. And I think it is very important that we see our tradition through the eyes of those who see it from the margins. We don't understand our traditions unless we hear their voices and we learn to see through their eyes as well. This computer Afterwards, hopefully it's easier than thinking. For those who may not know much about Dr. Ambedkar, he was born in 1891 into the Mahar caste, one of the largest untouchable castes in the state of Maharashtra. I just want to pictures of them talking biographical. As a child, he experienced the humiliation of untouchability in its many forms. Barbers refused to cut his hair. Cart drivers would not transport him. Teachers denied him the opportunity to study Sanskrit, forced him to sit on a mat at the back of the class, refused to touch his books. With amazing perseverance and support, Ambedkar became the first untouchable to graduate from college in 1908 with a degree in economics. With a scholarship from the state of Baroda, Ambedkar attended Columbia University in New York, completing a master's degree and then a PhD in economics. He also studied at the London School of Economics and earned a DSc there. He was admitted to the bar as a barrister. He was probably the best educated Indian of his time. And when he returned from England, he could not find housing. He was actually thrown out of housing in Mumbai when it was discovered that he was a Mahar. He devoted himself to combating the injustices of untouchability, eventually rising to become, this is the swearing-in ceremony, to become independent India's first law minister and chairman of the drafting committee for the constitution of India. He resigned later from Nehru's cabinet because of disputes about the Hindu Code Bill. He was then appointed to the Rajya Sabha, the upper house, where he served until his death in 1956 at the age of 65. He was a very prolific writer, but as one of his editors noted, S. Anand, his works have the curious distinction of being one of the most obscure as well as one of the most widely read. But his works are still only read largely within his Dalit community. Sometimes it's said, that the greatest tragedy of a scholar is to be ignored. In the case of Ambedkar, perhaps one could say that the greatest tragedy of a reformer is to be embraced by everyone. Today he's celebrated recently in India, a lot of celebrations about him, but not taken very seriously as a thinker, as someone who challenged his culture and his tradition. I am interested in Ambedkar for many reasons, as I said. I think he remains he has offered the most passionate and insightful critique of the caste system, coming from a brilliant mind who personally experienced its violence and its injustice as an impediment to human sustainability and to flourishing. I think his critique remains as relevant today as when he first delivered it almost 80 years ago. And unfortunately, as I will also demonstrate in my presentation, many of there are many who still offer arguments to explain away the system that he himself contested and critiqued in his own time. This is a radical challenge to the Hindu tradition and its ideals. I don't often use PowerPoints, but I really use PowerPoints because I want you to hear his words, or to see the words of Ambedkar. And this is how he articulated the challenge. If I am disgusted with Hindus and Hinduism, it is because I am convinced that they cherish the wrong ideals and live a wrong social life. My quarrel with Hindus and Hinduism is not over the imperfections of their social conduct. It is much more fundamental. It is over their ideals. In making the case for the annihilation of caste, I think he tried to situate himself in the context of other reformers of his age. And one of the distinctions he wanted to make about himself and his work is he didn't want to be thought of only as a political reformer, because he felt that a political reform that ignores and leaves unaddressed the inequities and the problems of the social order are limited. And this is how he put it, that the emancipation of the mind and soul is a necessary preliminary for the political expansion of the people. Keep in mind that he is writing and speaking during the movement for the independence of India. And there were those who were saying, let's not worry about untouchability, let's get independence and then we'll deal with it. This was his response to that. He was also, he also sought to distinguish himself from the Marxists of his day, with whom he shared a lot, but he saw his approach differently. Those who were making the argument about economic determinism, that the problem of the untouchables is a problem of poverty and the structural economic problems. And while he agreed a lot with that, he felt that it was a simplistic response to the caste problem, arguing that economic problem is important, but it's not the only source of power. So as he put it here, if the source of power and dominion is at any given time or in any given society, social and religious, then social reform and religious reform must be accepted as a necessary part of reform. Then, of course, he had to engage all of those who were defending this system in his time. Now, I have done something I hope that you will find interesting in this lecture. He identified the arguments that existed in his own time in defense of caste, and he responded to them. I thought it would be interesting for me to look within the last 10 years and to see if those arguments were still carrying weight today. So the defense of caste is a division of labor found in all societies. This is written by a Hindu within the last 10 years. And I'll give you some examples of that to show you why this man is still relevant. So you can read people everywhere. I'm not going to tell you the source of it, but this is very recent defense of caste, or very recent explanation of the system. People everywhere divide themselves up into castes. We have workers, you go to work and you work under somebody else. That happens all over the world. That's the Shudra caste. We have merchants who are self-motivated, that's the Vaishya caste. We have the politicians and the lawmakers and the law enforcement people, that's the Kshatriya caste. And then you have the priests, the ministers, the missionaries, that's the Brahmin caste. Every society has these three castes working with it in one way or another. In today's world, if one is not fulfilling the dharma of his born caste, then he changes caste. For instance, if a Brahmin husband and wife are working 8 to 15 hours a day in a hospital, under others, they are no longer of the Brahmin caste, they are no longer performing the duties of that caste, they are workers in the Shudra caste. What does Ambedkar say? What would he say? He would say that caste is not merely a division of labor, as this articulation suggests. He was fond of saying it is a division of the laborers. This division is not innocuous, as such a quote might suggest, because it is hierarchical, it is unequal, it is not a spontaneous division based on natural aptitude, it is a hereditary division. Defense number 2, caste exists among Muslims, Sikhs and Christians, perhaps written within the last 5 years. I think this is a more recent piece written by a scholar. It is really observed that the social hierarchy is not just limited to Hinduism, but it stays intact in any Indian religious society. Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, Christians, and Muslims have their own caste hierarchies and restrictions. Even Western societies have their own classes and groups. Thus, it is indeed a social phenomenon which is not limited to Hinduism or India. True, there is a lot of truth in that, but it is one that seeks to minimize the significance of this social hierarchy by citing its existence in other communities, and that's a very weak defense of any form of injustice to say that it is present elsewhere. So Dr. Ambedkar doesn't question the reality of such structures in other communities, but he spends a lot of his time highlighting critical differences in his writings. The most significant of which is that that other traditions have not treated caste as sacred and as legitimized by some kind of sacred order. So he argued that it's a dangerous delusion to take comfort in the mere existence of such structures in other communities. Third, and perhaps the most interesting, and even the most contemporary, and many of you will recognize this, caste is a fourfold qualification of human beings based on qualities, guna, and not birth, janma. This defense of caste upholds the fourfold classification. So many today say, caste is a Portuguese word. What we have in the Hindu tradition is varna, which is different from caste. And this is an argument that he had to deal with in his own period of time. So this is a defense of the system that upholds the fourfold classification, but on the basis of, it says it's really based on individual disposition. It's a character ordering of human community. It's an argument that is associated in a very special way with the reformist Arya Samaj movement founded by Swami Dayananda Saraswati in the 19th century. It also traces, it's an argument that traces its lineage to a very well-known and difficult and controversial verse in the Bhagavad Gita, Chaturvarna Maya Srishtam, I created this fourfold order, guna karma vibhagata, based on the distinction of qualities and action. What does Dr. Ambedkar say? And I've tried to pull arguments from different places in his writings to give a rebuttal of this interpretation, which I think is the most popular contemporary defense or explanation or attempt to explain it. First, and I have to go through these pretty quickly and just list them. So, is there a necessity for labeling people in this way, he asks? After all, the names Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra are names that are associated with a definite and fixed notion in the mind of every Hindu. The notion is itself hierarchical, and as long as these names are retained, the hierarchies of higher and lower are deeply embedded and they will persist. You can't, he says in other words, you can't speak about an ordering of human beings with these labels that are so hierarchical, so ingrained, so steeped in inequality, and suddenly hope that you're going to strip the inequality that is embedded in this kind of terminology. Secondly, his objection is a more pragmatic one. It's very interesting, and he asks, how are you going to compel people who have acquired a higher status based on birth, without reference to their worth, to vacate their status? Will they ever recognize as equal those who are currently classified lower on the basis of birth, but who deserve a higher status on the basis of worth? In addition, how will such a system be maintained? What will the sanctions be for transgression? What happens to the women in the system, he asks? Are they classified on the basis of the worth of their worth, or do they assume the varna of their husbands? Assuming the varna status of their husbands defeats the classification based on worth. And if they are classified based on worth, he asks, will you allow them to become priests? Third objection is to the very idea of a fourfold classification. His argument is that the diversity, richness, and flexibility of human nature makes it impossible to classify human beings in these four groups. So Chaturvarnya must fail for the very reason he says that Plato Republic failed. Namely, that it is impossible to present human beings into four types. And his next argument is that Chaturvarnya makes groups unreasonably dependent on each other for the fulfillment of vital needs. Groups suffer when other groups do not pursue their own vocations or fail to fulfill their responsibilities. The Shudras in particular, the most vulnerable, if other groups don't fulfill their vocation. Why shouldn't a human being be knowledgeable, be capable of defending himself, earning his wealth? Why must he depend on other groups to meet those needs for him or for her? Now, in the next section of my presentation, I call it Ambedkar's challenge, and I present two excerpts from his writings. This is how he put it. He felt that in spite of his complexity, and this is what concerned him the most, Hindus were convinced that this system was an obligation rooted in sacred tradition. They observe caste because they are deeply religious. People are not wrong in observing caste. In my view, what is wrong is their religion, which has inculcated this notion of caste. If this is correct, then obviously the enemy you must grapple with is not the people who observe caste, but the Shastras, who teach them this religion of caste. It's very similar note. Hindus hold to the sacredness of the social order, caste as a divine basis. You must therefore destroy the sacredness and divinity with which the caste has become invested. In this last analysis, you must destroy the truth of the Shastras and the Vedas. This sentence in a famous lecture he was supposed to give led to the cancellation of the lecture. He refused to change the text. A single word he said, I'm not going to change in my text. He was also convinced that the Hindu tradition would not work to reform this system. He felt that a movement for the dismantling of caste would not be possible. And he gave a lot of reasons in his writings for that. I have also summarized why he was disillusioned. As you know, just before he died, he converted to Buddhism because of this feeling of disillusion about his tradition. First of all, he felt that those who benefited most from the system, in terms of prestige and status, the Brahmins, they would not work for its dismantling. Secondly, he felt that the system was so hierarchical that it was very difficult to mobilize people of different castes to come together in a concerted movement for its overcoming. As he put it, all are slaves of the caste system, but all slaves are not equal in this system. Thirdly, and this is an interesting argument or exegesis that he keeps on making, that the Hindu tradition does not allow for the use of reason in the interpretation of its sacred text. And this makes it impossible, he argued, to contest this system on rational grounds. There is a quote on that one. How are you going to break up caste if people are not free to consider whether it calls it reason? How are you going to break up caste if people are not free to consider whether it calls it morality? The wall built around caste is impregnable, and the material out of which it is built contains none of the combustible stuff of reason and morality. He cites Manusmriti a lot for the exegetical principles that he sees operating in this tradition. But I don't blame, how could I? He was a man who had no access to this tradition, and whose any access he had to seek for himself. But I think that the Hindu tradition does have a rational basis for the reading of text. Unfortunately, Ambedkar was not convinced of that. I can't develop it here in great detail, but basically to say that the Vedanta traditions in particular understand the authority of a sacred text to be grounded in two principles. One, the sacred text must reveal something which cannot be known otherwise, and secondly, whatever it reveals must not be contradicted by any other sources of knowledge. What this means, if one were to apply it as a critical tool, is that when we look at a sacred text or we look at a verse, it's not satisfactory just to say that it occurs within the Veda or it occurs in any sacred text. There are two questions that one must ask. Does this tell us something that we don't know otherwise? And secondly, is it contradicted by what we know from any other source? If we apply that criteria to reading those passages in sacred texts that speak about caste, I think they will not meet the criteria. Easily we could argue against such passages, because even Shankara would have said, as he says in his commentary on Bhagavad Gita, that 100 sacred texts can say that fire is cold. It doesn't make it true. So it doesn't matter whether the verse is within a sacred text. The question is, does the verse satisfy the criteria of novelty and non-contradictedness? And that's a kind of a criteria that allows for the search for the text within the text. If I may put it in that way. So, one of the tragedies of Ambedkar is that he was the finest and the most brilliant interlocutor of Gandhi. And that's what is the most famous film, David Attenborough's film on Gandhi. He doesn't even make it as a footnote. He doesn't make it as a footnote. But he challenged Gandhi critically on this caste issue. And on the basis of Gandhi's, as you may know, may not know, Gandhi was in support of hereditary occupation. And Gandhi wrote against Ambedkar's challenging of the caste system and tried to make a case for hereditary occupation. And Ambedkar had to write in response to Gandhi's response to his writings on many points. And he says, if he made it very personal. He says, and do you follow ancestral? Have you followed your ancestral vocation? And if I followed mine, I would be sweeping the streets in Maharashtra. He made it that personal with Gandhi on this issue of caste. Now, this illusionment with the Hindu tradition was also based on how he saw the tradition in its entirety. And he makes a very interesting distinction in his writings between what he calls rules and principles. And this is how he describes them. Rules are practical. They are habitual ways of doing things according to prescription. But principles are intellectual. They are useful methods of judging things. Rules seek to tell an agent what course of action to pursue. Principles do not prescribe a specific course of action. Rules like cooking recipes do tell just what to do and how to do it. A principle such as that of justice supplies a main heading by reference to which he is to consider the bearings of his desires and purposes. It guides him in his thinking by suggesting to him the important considerations which he should bear in mind. So a rules-based tradition, according to Ambedkar, encourages mechanical responses. Principles encourage responsibility and conscious intentionality of choices. And he felt, as he experienced the Hindu tradition, that it was largely a tradition of rules and not principles. in this context, he identifies the entirety of the Hindu tradition very much with the approach of what, if you're familiar, we speak of the Purva tradition, and his definition of dharma, which is kodana lakshanartho dharma. Dharma is that which can only be taught through injunction. Do this or don't do that. And he saw the entirety of the Hindu tradition as based on these kinds of injunctions. And so, as he says, what's called religion by the Hindus is nothing but a multitude of commands and prohibition. Religion in the sense of spiritual principles, truly universal, applicable to all races, to all countries, at all times, is not to be found in them. It does not form a governing part of the Hindu's life. So that's his experience of the tradition. So when he calls, it's nuanced. So when he calls for the destruction of the Hindu tradition, actually he's calling for the destruction of the tradition based on rules, not principles. So this is how he puts it. Before his conversion, this is what he said. He made his conversion in Nagpur. In the public lecture, you must give a new doctrinal basis to your religion, a basis that will be in consonance with liberty, equality, and fraternity. These are the words that I will invoke this morning by Professor Tucker. And you can see what it meant in his time. And she was calling for a new understanding of it. In short, democracy. But I am no authority on this subject. But I am told that for such principles as will be consonant with liberty, equality, and fraternity, this is interesting, it may not be necessary for you to borrow from foreign sources, and that you could draw for such principles on the Upanishads. Whether you could do so without a complete remolding, a considerable scraping and chipping off from the ore they contain is more like insane. This means a complete change in the fundamental notions of life. It means a complete change in the values of life. It means a complete change in outlook and attitude towards men and things. He didn't see himself as a person to do that. That was not his job. He was on the verge of embracing the Buddhist tradition, where he thought he found a religion that was principle based. So in enunciating the principles that were necessary for human flourishing and for sustenance in human communities, he repeatedly identified these three principles, of course very known: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And he felt that the Hindu tradition, as he had encountered this tradition, provided no principles for the articulation of these sustaining values. The values of equality and fraternity imply the human being as worthy of reverence and love, and the wish to be in unity with others. These find expression in a concern for the well-being of others. Liberty of movement, thought, and action is necessary for the proper development of the human being. But he gave pride of place among all three to fraternity, which he felt was a sustaining value for both liberty and equality. And for him, fraternity had its roots in a religious worldview. In fact, he translated it as Maitri in Sanskrit. Maitri. I know my time is running, but I'm going to move very fast. But this is a very important part of his thinking. His distinction between what he calls Brahmanism, and Vedanta. It's an N that makes a difference, so I put it in bold. There. Brahmaism, Brahmanism, and Vedanta. This was a really revealing part of his writing to me. So he articulates this theology of what he calls Brahmaism, and he grounds it in the Upanishads. And he grounds it in one of the great sentences of the Upanishads, which is in Sanskrit, Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma. Besides this, all is Brahma. And he refers to two other of the Mahavakyas, Tattvamasi, I am Atma Brahma. Those are the three Upanishadic texts that he cites. And he calls the teaching that emerges out of these texts as Brahmaism, not Brahmanism. And you'll see why he had this contention with Vedanta. So he has a problem with what he calls Vedanta, because as he says, Vedanta teaches the unreality of the world, whereas what he calls Brahmaism regards the world as real, but sees Brahma as constituting the ground and essence of everything. And of course, Brahmanism he rejects because it subscribes to caste, it subscribes to Vedic infallibility, and emphasizes a religion of rules. So he was not interested in it. But Brahmaism he saw as affirming the worth of human beings because of the equal and identical presence of Brahma, what he calls Brahma in every being. Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma, I am Atma Brahma. It makes a case for liberty and equality, but where did it fail? While the gist was there, the insight was there in the Upanishad, it failed because, as he says, it could not connect theology with life. It failed to connect theology with life. And the principal interpreters of the Upanishads interpreted all of those texts to justify asceticism and world renunciation, not world engagement. And here's where he has one of the sharpest statements about Shankara. What is more ridiculous is the teaching of the great Shankaracharya. For it was this Shankaracharya who taught that there is Brahma, and this Brahma is real. So he doesn't see Shankara as teaching world illusion. Shankara taught that Brahma is real, that there is Brahma, Brahma is real and pervades all, and at the same time, he says, upheld all the inequities of the Brahmanic society. His profound comment on Shankara. So let me, I'm rushing my conclusion because I really want to honor time. In the rest of my paper, presentation, my work, I try to show, as I said, Ambedkar was correct in his characterization of the inequities of Hindu society as interreligious. He also saw a glimmer of hope for a new flourishing theology in the Upanishads. And in the Mahavakyas of the Upanishad, he didn't see it as his task to do that. It is our task. Those of us who are committed to this tradition and still think that it's a tradition that has the possibility for providing a theology of human sustenance and flourishing, his challenge remains our work. And this is what we have to embrace. So I can only sketch what I developed in more detail, and of course in my book, most recent book, in Theology of Liberation, is not one. But I think that the Hindu theology of human flourishing must provide a theological basis for the equal worth of all human beings, and the refutation of the assumptions of inequality, impurity, and indignity that are the foundations of discrimination. These are the principles that must also provide values for justice. I want to say, unapologetically, we have to stop trying to provide explanations or to explain away caste. It is a brutal system, and we just have to say yes. Whatever its intentions might have been, in practice it became a system of social hierarchy brutalized and continues. Yesterday, David was pulled off a horse on the day of his wedding because it is not permissible for the lower caste to ride a horse as a groom going to meet him. So I'm not talking about Ambedkar 80 years ago. We're speaking about, not that I'm not denying the reality of change, and I'm talking about the challenge, the social challenge continues to be present. He saw in this glimmer of Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma, I am Atma Brahma, teaching about the equality of the presence of God in all beings. He saw the potential of this teaching to be a source of human dignity and equal worth. He saw it as a spiritual antidote to deny his personhood, but he thinks that the Hindu tradition did not do its job with that insight. So he was correct in problematizing those interpretations of the Upanishads. I am with Ambedkar, that are not attentive to significance of life in this world. Those interpretations written largely by renunciants who had turned their back on the world and didn't see the potential, the rich potential in these texts to speak to our contemporary challenges, our contemporary context. Those renunciants who offered a this-worldly interpretation of liberation and saw it as freedom from the world and not freedom, a way of being in the world. We read all of that. Right, so a Hindu theology of human flourishing has to be a world-affirming theology. It has to champion a more expansive understanding of human suffering and also of the meaning of liberation. But to do that, we need a self-critical scholarship. And unfortunately, in the current political atmosphere, that's a difficult kind of scholarship to undertake in the Hindu world, in the Hindu tradition. But we will not be a flourishing tradition without such self-critical scholarship, where we hold our tradition responsible. We are less defensive. And we're citing the injustices of other traditions doesn't excuse or justify injustice within our own tradition. And such a theology of flourishing will never happen unless we are attentive to the voices of those who have and those who continue experiencing our tradition as one that denies them sustenance and denies them the opportunity to flourish. I conclude by saying that our traditions are challenged in powerful ways by the voices of those at the margins and by those we exclude. And in contemporary times, there is no critical voice as brilliant and as insightful about the oppressive face of the Hindu tradition than Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. The potential of the Hindu tradition to contribute to human flourishing will not be realized without this kind of challenge that comes obtained from it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Professor Rambachan. Our next session ostensibly starts at 2:30. However, we'll take 5 minutes for some questions. Did you have an announcement?
No, I have a comment.
Okay.
And, I'll make it as brief as possible. There's Hindu theology, and then there's the Hindu ethical norms, or not even ethical norms, let's say customs and norms of behavior. So one of the questions I had asked my academic guide and my spiritual teacher, two separate people, is that, if I look at Advaita Vedanta and I look at Dvaita, or I look at Vishishta Dvaita, or I look at Achintya Bheda Aved, these are very different theologies. And yet, you don't have ethical structures developing from these distinctive theologies that are distinct from each other. And so, could one say that the problem that is evident here is that theology seems to have felt that it needed to transcend the day-to-day engagement with the social, the ecological, the environmental, the economic, and left all of that to a lower and different realm of Hindu experience and authority. Because the authority that comes with the theologians is a different authority and a higher one than the ones that come with, priestcraft and the tradition as practiced in temples and the customs and so forth. So this distinction and the lack of integration or the lack of outreach from theological reflection into engagement with the world, is that not possibly a foundational problem here? And the second thing is, it seems to me that Dr. Ambedkar, perhaps because he didn't have access to it, was speaking from a place of, to be kind, not religious scholarship, in the sense that there are Hindu traditions that did not bother about Varna, that are, semi-classical sampradayas, like the Brahma, Madhva, Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, 15th century, and Shakta Tantric yogic sampradayas going back a long ways, the fact of over 20 female sages, rishikas, in the Veda, the fact of Hindu women having initiation, Upanayan, in the early stages. I mean, there's such historical complexity to it. Perhaps he didn't have access to all of that. And in a way that's unfortunate, because I think that in order to, if we want to move towards a society that is, a level playing field, not just in terms of economics, but in terms of principles, then one has to come with a historical critical attitude, but also one has to know the many exceptions within this framework he's created.
Your comment deserves a lot of more time to respond. I just take two sentences. One is that I think that, again, those who wrote the commentaries on this text of all of these traditions, most of the commentators were renunciants. And whatever they might tell us, there's no doubt that when you read a text, what you read in the text is also profoundly influenced by who you are and what your location in the society is. And I think that many of the ascetic commentators on the Upanishads and other texts have spent a lot of their time problematizing life in the world. Very few of them have given us the reason to embrace life in the world. And that remains something that we have to articulate a theology of why life in this world is good. Why is it good to be a husband, and to be a wife, and to be a professor, and to be a father, to be a mother, and not hope that all of these are means someday to become a renunciant? Why is not the fullness of life to be experienced in all of these roles, and why can't life be seen also as celebration in many ways? I think that remains an important. My second point is that I think that Ambedkar was a remarkable scholar of the Hindu tradition. He probably read more widely than any Hindu of his own age read into those texts. He taught himself Sanskrit to be able to read. So he comes with a lot of admiration for his scholarship, given the resources that he had in his own time. But it is easy, and I'm not saying that's what your comment is saying. Again, we can always respond to structures of injustice as we do in the Hindu tradition, often by citing ancient ideals. It was the failure of those ideals to connect with reality that troubled him so much. And perhaps it is too much to ask of a man who felt so oppressed by this tradition that, in spite of becoming the first law minister of India and chairing its commission, people never forgot that he was a man. What can we expect of a tradition, of a man who responds to a tradition that treated him in that kind of way?
Great, we have time for probably just 2 more questions, so we'll start here and go from there.
Yeah, first I just want to say Yoga Vasishta lifts up marriage, lifts up family, lifts up the world. And second of all, having mentored a master's thesis of an Indian priest, I think it's an Indian cultural issue, certainly not restricted to Hindus. And there was a bishop that came into Tanjore, or one of the dioceses in Tamil Nadu, and said, all doors are open to all people. And they beat him to a bloody pulp. And he had to maintain untouchables in the back of the church. So I think that it's big, it's a very large cultural...
Who beat them?
The parishioners.
Oh, hit the Christian version.
The Christian parishioners, yeah.
I would like to make a comment and ask a question.
We had
The comment is that untouchability is not at all anywhere mentioned in any Hindu scriptures. The Varga is mentioned because it was functional at the time, but untouchability is not. What happened over a period is a social issue. It's not a fault in the philosophy. So it needs to be clarified that if the churches condone marriage, that may end in divorce. That doesn't make marriage bad.
Do you want to respond?
Just have some more comments.
Oh, okay. I think you've been holding your hand up, so...
Since I grew up with this, I originally, grew up in Arya Samaj. We had no idea of untouchability. So my mother used to bring the Dalit woman across the street to cook for us. So we grew up that way. Okay? Now when we go to second Dayanand Saraswati, who's your guru, my guru, also in Vedanta, the idea, it incorporated himself during the time of Harshvardhan. He was not, it comes from another tradition, I don't want to name and start a fight there. The idea of untouchability comes from the idea of purity. And so the Dalits were, what they call Dalits, were not part of the Varna system. They are the fifth one, or the outside the Varna. So when Dayanand Saraswati from Sailor's who's a Vedantist, went to give them, hey, I will teach you. The head of the Dalit society said, please don't come. We already have order here. Don't disturb our order within the Dalit community. And he said, I was surprised. They didn't want him to come and start another order. Just
One
giving one.
interesting question that we should all ask ourselves. We have all of these Sampradays, Neo-Vedanta Sampradaya.
Could you speak up a bit, please?
Now, say we have all of these Sampradayas today, founded by great teachers, Chinmaya Mission, Swami Dayananda Saraswati, Ramakrishna Mission. It will be a fascinating study to see how many of the sannyasis are Dalits who come from Dalit community. We should undertake how many Dalits are brought into those ashramas to be trained as sannyasis, to study Vedas, to study Sanskrit. That would be perhaps something, not only talking the talk, but see, are they walking the walk in one way or another?
There's a lot more hands. Should we...
We just have no time, but I just want to say one thing, that I think that the important point here should not be lost. And that is that you are asking for constructive Hindu theology. And
I am.
that is,
I am an engaged lover of my tradition, but I am an engaged self-critical lover of my tradition. And I will not give up that self-critical voice, nor will I give up the love of my tradition. Both of them exist in me as in a relationship, a very important relationship. Some would like me to go in one direction, some in the other. But I live with the tension of being a critical lover of this tradition that continues to nourish me.
Attention, everyone.
Please be back in 10 minutes. The reason we have to take the time is because the library closes